Good morning, my name is Eli Darkash. I'm Director of Compliance for Feeding Northeast Florida, and today we're going to be talking about food safety training. This program was developed by Feeding America and Unsafe as the food safety handler level, not the manager level, but handler level. And it's designed as a supplement to the state required certification. What I'm providing for you today does not certify you recognizable by the state for food safety handling, but this is designed as a supplement. But you can use this in its concepts to train your volunteers and agencies or anywhere else that might be helpful to make sure they're handling the food safely, that no one will get sick from the food that you distribute. Okay? So today we're going to be talking about the importance of food safety, good personal hygiene, receiving food safely, how to evaluate, transport, and store food safely, cleaning and sanitizing, and so forth. And typically there's a test at the end of this that you would take a 30-question test. I'll be attaching this for you to be able to administer to those to make sure that they have paid attention and are compliant. Okay? So let's talk about let's start with the importance of food safety. The concepts you're going to learn include how food becomes unsafe, understanding about food allergens, and preventing food allergen contamination. Okay, so first we're going to talk about how food becomes unsafe with hazards from the environment. Basically there's three categories of hazards. So you have your biological hazards, your physical hazards, and chemical hazards. Now biological, we would get into a lot more depth in the manager level training when you get into stuff like Listeria and E. coli and all these different types of pathogens that you need to be careful about. But for today's purpose, we're just going to talk about the overall biological category. Includes your microscopic pathogens and mold and stuff that grows when time and temperature of use is not good. We'll talk about that more depth, just so you know that the three categories of hazards include biological. The physical hazard would include stuff actually in your food that you can choke on. So that could be shards of plastic or glass or metal. It could be jewelry or whatever. Anything that's physical in your food that you can choke on to be a physical hazard. And the last category of hazard is the chemical hazard. That would be something that would be whether either not cleaned properly or let's say, for example, if you have chemical over food that drips on top, that'd be a chemical type hazard, or a spray or something along those lines. Okay. The main way food becomes unsafe is us as people. We make food unsafe in four main ways. We make food unsafe by poor personal hygiene, through time and temperature abuse, cross-contamination, and poor cleaning and sanitizing. So poor personal hygiene is when pathogens get transferred from our body to food, and that could be from coughing in your hands or rubbing your hands through your hair, any number of ways that you can make food unsafe through poor personal hygiene. Time and temperature abuse would be when food stays too long in temperatures that are good for pathogen growth. So for example, if you had perishable product in your cooler or your freezer and it's out of that temperature for too long, it rises into the danger zone, which we're going to talk about later. So we need to keep that time and temperature in mind when we're thinking about perishable product. Okay, the next way is cross-contamination, is when pathogens get transferred from one surface of food to another surface of food. And what that means basically, if you have a product that needs to be cooked, like raw, stored above ready-to-eat product, and that raw juices leak down, that would be an example of cross-contamination. You'd avoid that at all costs. It's a very risky practice to follow. The last way that people make food unsafe is poor cleaning and sanitizing, and that's when pathogens get transferred from incorrectly cleaned surfaces to food. That's why it's really important to sanitize anything that could potentially touch food. We'll talk about that in more depth as well. Okay? So the next concept we want to go over is allergens. Allergens basically is a common food type that people have sensitivity to. There's something called the Big 8 allergens that is over 95% of food allergies are these Big 8. That includes milk and dairy, eggs, soy, fish, tree nuts, peanuts, crustacean or seafood, and wheat. So those 8 allergens you have to handle differently. And so it's something where, as an example, I used to work with a coworker who had a severe allergen to seafood, and she didn't even have to eat it. She just had to be around it, and she would swell up. She would have a tough time breathing. She was very high sensitivity to seafood, and if some of that was accidentally put into her food and she didn't know about it, it would make her really sick. Sometimes it's even fatal. So it's really important to take allergens seriously. So as far as allergens preventing cross-contact is basically a subcategory of contamination that has to do with allergens. So to prevent cross-contact, meaning allergens touching something without allergens, we want to clean and sanitize your surfaces that come in contact with an allergen. So you want to inspect your food packaging for leaks or spills that can cause that cross-contact. You want to wash your hands and change your gloves after handling the allergens, as well as before handling allergen-free food. It's really important to store food with allergens separately from allergen-free products. So at our food bank, for example, when we receive pallets of milk or pallets of eggs or something along those lines, we want to make sure that in our cooler we store the pallets above each other. If there's no chance that we're going to put something else underneath and have those allergens spill on top, we tag it with a big orange tag, say allergens, so everyone knows to treat it separately. Likewise, when you're pulling orders or loading your vehicle, you don't want to put allergens above anything else or double stacked above anything else. You want to make sure allergens are on the bottom without any chance of them leaking on something else. You want to use dedicated pallets or bins for those pallets containing products containing allergens. You may notice when you go to the grocery store, when you're in the checkout counter and you have milk or eggs, they're going to put that in a separate bag from the rest of your groceries. And the reason for that is to prevent that cross-contact. It's something that we're required to do for food safety. All right, so quick pop quiz. What is the problem here if we are leaving raw chicken on a pallet in a loading area that is not refrigerated? Is that an example of A, time and temperature abuse, B, poor personal hygiene, C, cross-contamination, or D, poor cleaning and sanitizing? Hopefully if you've been paying attention, the correct answer is A, time and temperature abuse. Which food item is a common food allergen? Is it eggplant or pecan pie? Pecan or pecan, any way you like to pronounce that. Again, if you're paying attention, the correct answer is pecan pie because it includes milk, possibly wheat, and as well as pecans, obviously, as a tree nut. Even though eggplant has the word egg in the plant, produce is not a common food allergen. Next one is, how is cross-contamination being prevented in this photo? And again, if you've been paying attention, the answer is the ready-to-eat food is stored above raw food, so there's no risk of contamination in that scenario. Congratulations. So next we're going to be talking about good personal hygiene. So now you're going to be learning about how and when to wash your hands, other hand care guidelines, and important practices. This is the most common way that food becomes contaminated is from poor personal hygiene and from people not washing their hands correctly. Hand washing should take about 20 seconds, which is a lot longer than people would normally think. It's long enough to sing the alphabet twice. Usually, your random person would go in and wash their hands, they're done. That's not sufficient enough to clean your hands properly. So there's several steps to take to wash your hands properly. The first one is obviously to wet your hands and arms with running water as hot as you can stand. Then you apply soap, enough to build up a good lather, but not so much it leaves residue. And you want to scrub your hands and arms vigorously for at least 10 to 15 seconds, cleaning underneath your fingernails, between your fingers, and so forth. Rinsing your hands and arms thoroughly with running warm water, and then drying your hands and arms, not using your clothes or apron or anything like that. You want to use a single-use paper towel or hand dryer. And then after you wash your hands, hang on to that paper towel, because then you want to turn off the faucet and open that door with that same towel. You don't know what steps other people take behind closed doors. So you just cancel everything out if you're using the handles that someone has not washed their hands use. And then you can open your restroom door that way. Then we get to antiseptics like sanitizer. You never want to use those instead of hand washing. The reason for that is what cleans your hands is the water pressure. If you just use sanitizer by itself, all you're doing is rubbing around dirt and the gel. It's not cleaning your hands. What it's designed to do is to reduce the risk of germs and viruses and that kind of thing after your hands are clean to prevent yourself from getting sick. So you want to wait for the antiseptic to dry before you touch food. It reduces the pathogens to safe levels, basically. All right, other hand care guidelines, we're going to talk about using gloves correctly, disposable gloves. We use those a lot in our industry. Definitely want to use single-use gloves when handling food, making sure those gloves fit your hands. You don't want to rinse them or wash them or reuse them. Hopefully you have lots and lots of supply of disposable gloves, so you don't want to use you don't have to use the same pair of gloves all day long. If they get dirty, torn, or using a different task, just throw them away and start with a new set. It's why they're disposable. They shouldn't be too tight or too loose. Don't blow into them. Don't roll them on or anything like that. Gloves should be changed before you start a new task, before you handle any food with a known allergen, after you handle any type of raw meat, seafood, or poultry, and before handling any ready-to-eat food, as well as after an interruption like taking a phone call. Your phone is dirty, has a lot of germs on it, so make sure you change your gloves afterwards. As far as when you want to report any symptoms to a supervisor, it's critical from a food safety perspective that if it could pass along any bodily fluids, if there's any chance of that, you have to report that to your supervisor. And that could be anything from diarrhea to nausea and vomiting to cold and flu symptoms to sore throat with fever, jaundice, yellowing of your eyes and skin. Even if you have any open wounds, you need to cover that with a Band-Aid and then cover that overall with a disposable glove. Anything like that, you just want to make sure you're being as cautious as you can. Next, we're going to talk about receiving food safely. As far as concepts, how to control your time and temperature during receiving, and inspecting the food during receiving to make sure it's safe. Right, so the first basic concept that's really important to get is the danger zone. The temperature danger zone is 41 degrees on the low end and 135 degrees on the high end. Pathogens on food can grow in this range between 41 and 135 and cause a foodborne illness. And the closer you get to the middle of that range is the fastest those pathogens grow. They multiply the quickest. So that's why you have to think about how long you're out of that temperature, because the higher temperature gets, the more risk you run. And those food temperatures must be controlled from delivery of product all the way to distribution, every step of that supply chain through. Okay? So at the food bank, we don't do any cooking, so we don't have to worry too much about the 135, the high end. But if you do cook, not only has to get to that point in cooking, but you have to stay above that when you're holding it and serving it and so forth. So that's very, very important. And you have different temperatures according to what you're cooking, whether it be poultry, beef, or pork. So you really have to know what you're working with and what the temperature requirements are. By the food bank, we worry about cooling and freezing and for both receipt, storing, and distribution. So that 41 degrees is the low end of that danger zone. So how we handle that is our cooler is typically at 38 degrees, and our freezers hold product at 0 degrees or below, so it remain frozen solid, it doesn't thaw. That's very important. As far as time, once it leaves the cooler, we give it a maximum of 1 hour on the share floor before it has to go back in to try to minimize that risk. But especially you want to think about when it's out of the cooler, what are you bringing it into? Is it in the heat of the sun? Is it inside in a room temperature? Because the temperature you're bringing that product out to is going to make that product temperature rise that much faster. So that hour, for example, might be at room temperature, but if you're bringing it to the sun, you got to bring that down to maybe half an hour as your max time out of the cooler, because then you got to think about what that product temperature is. And we're going to talk about how to measure that next with the common thermometers. So there's three basic types of thermometers to measure the product temperature and the temperature of your storage unit. The first one is infrared. The next one is thermocouple and digital, and the last one's bimetallic stemmed. So according to what you're going to be doing is the use for each of these. So what we recommend is the infrared thermometer. It's basically a temp gun, and the reason it's recommended, it displays the temperatures instantly with the digital readout. That prevents cross-contamination and damage to food because it does not touch the food. You can get your accurate temperature 6 to 12 inches away. The downside is it only measures the surface temperature of the food and the equipment. It doesn't measure the internal product temperature. So But for our intents and purposes, the temp gun is what we use. If you're going to do any type of cooking, then we recommend using a probe to get inside that internal temperature. That'd be like a thermocouple or digital thermometer, where you don't need to insert it deep to get an accurate reading. It does display the temperatures quickly with the digital readout. Many do come with probes for checking liquids and air temperature and equipment as well. If everyone knows the bimetallic stem thermometer, that's what you would use during Thanksgiving time. That's where you have thermometer you have to insert deep into the turkey, for example, because it measures it from the stem to the dimple is the sensor. The downside, it does require at least 15 seconds before a final reading can be taken, but you can easily calibrate it using either boiling point of 212 degrees for water, or 32 degrees is ice water. It's like crushed ice, tap water, and so forth. You wait 30 seconds and you can calibrate to 32 degrees that way. Alright, so next let's talk about inspecting the food during receiving. What you should look for when inspecting the product. You want to reject it if the refrigerated food is 41 degrees or lower, if the frozen food is not frozen solid, if the cut produce is not 41 degrees or lower, and whole produce you have dry storage temperature. So those are all basic temperature requirements when you're receiving food. As far as evaluating and repacking and transporting and storing food safely, we're going to learn about some concepts next, how to do so. So let's start with evaluating. This is often in use with our volunteer section, where they're looking at expiration dating, they're looking at the how severe dents are, if there's any risk of open atmosphere exposure to product. So for example, we'll start with cans. Cans typically are dented when they get donated. That's why they get donated to begin with. But how severe that dent is, it depends if it can be used or not. So if you have any of these symptoms, the cans need to be discarded. And again, the good rule of thumb is when in doubt, you throw it out. So if there's a severe dent in the can seam, which is the top or bottom of that can, it has to be thrown away. If there's a deep dent in the can body where you can't stick your thumb and touch the inside of that dent, it has to be thrown away. If it's a crushed can you cannot stack on top of each other, throw away. If it's missing a label or unreadable label due to stains and tears, if there's no code dates, if there's any swollen or bulging cans, that's a risk of botulism. If there's any rust that cannot be wiped off, any holes, any visible signs of leakings, those are all throwaway symptoms. So let's take a look at these samples here and play along and tell me what you see as an issue on these cans. Let's start with the top left corner. Hopefully you're noticing that the top left corner, it's bulging at the seam. Again, that's the example of risk of botulism. The top middle one, you'll notice that the seam is too deep. It's folded over. You can't touch your thumb on the inside. That's a throwaway can of tomatillos. Next one, we have seam dent. On the top right corner, you'll see that the seam dent is masking whether there's any type of leak or hole in there, so that needs to be thrown away. Bottom left corner, you'll see that there is no label, so who knows what's inside that can? Who knows what date it is? Who knows the ingredients or the allergens or anything else? That's got to be thrown away. You may find some bright cans in some circumstances that has a code date on it. They might be able to look up that way, but that's an unusual situation. And last, on the bottom right corner, you see rust on the top lid that cannot be wiped off. So that's the example of it leaking from the inside. All right, so those will all be throwaway situations. Next, we're going to talk about jars and bottles. Similar to the cans, you're going to be throwing away if it has any of these symptoms. If it's missing a label or unreadable label, no code dates, dented lids, swollen lids, rusted lids, loose lids. If the button in the lid is raised, you can pop your thumb and you hear audible pop. That means there's air inside. That's no good. It's got to get thrown away. If there is homemade product like pickled or jams, jellies, anything like that, we're not going to accept that as donations. Who knows what the food safety conditions are for whoever's kitchen made that, as well as it's not a USDA product with approved labeling and so forth, so we don't accept anything like that. No signs of leakage, should that be a throwaway symptom? Any food containing mold or foreign objects? Any discoloration or unusual appearance separation, those are all throwaway scenarios for jars and bottles. So let's look at these next examples. Top left corner looks like mayonnaise. I would not want to eat that. You probably would not either. It looks like some type of appearance discoloration issue. Top middle looks like a jelly, has some type of mold in the top that you're going to throw that away. Top right corner, it's some type of ragu that has leaking out the top. That's throwaway. Bottom left corner, I don't see a label, and it looks like homemade. We're not going to accept that. That's a reject. And the bottom right corner, it's looks like a milk that has open lid, so that's open packaging. That's no good. Last type of food you'll come across in dry evaluation would be packaged, bagged, boxed. It's that kind of product. You're going to throw away if it's unlabeled or not correctly labeled, if it's not readable label, if it's no code dates or any signs of pests. That could be chewing or clawing or evidence otherwise. I won't get too much detail there, but there's also something called weevils. I don't know if you've heard of weevils before. That's basically where you have a sealed package, but there's still like small beetles running around inside. The reason that happens is that weevils are larvae that hatch after 4 weeks of storage. And you'll typically find that in grains or like cereal, rice, pasta, stuff like that. So it's really, really important to re-inspect your product after 3 to 4 weeks, because that's their life cycle of the insect, basically. Just a FYI. Also, you want to throw away your product if there's any stained or wet packaging. And anything that's taped over needs to be thrown away as well. So you'll often come across bags of flour or sugar or even pet food that's taped shut. We have to throw that away because it's already been open packaging. Even though 3/4 may be full, and you hate to waste it, at the same time, for food safety reasons, we cannot redistribute that type of product. Lastly, you have single packaging food that's been opened. The one exception is cereal, where you have maybe the outer container is open but the inner container is still intact. That's okay. We can still use that because the inner packaging is still intact. And you may want to either tape it shut or just go ahead and redistribute it that way. All right, next is produce. So produce, when we evaluate produce, you want to throw it away if you see any signs of mold or decay or rot. Bad odors, severe bruises, if the skin's not intact, if your cut produce is not 41 degrees or lower, if it's not have a code date if it's cut, any signs of insects at all, any repackaging in non-food safe containers. Those are all throwaway scenarios for produce. In the example you see here, you see a container of strawberries, and it looks like the middle of the carton of strawberries has mold, and the outer container looks okay. What would you do in this scenario if you come across this? Well, I can tell you at the food bank, we're going to throw that whole thing away. And the reason is you don't know what's been jostling around in transit. The outer ones may look okay now, but it's not going to look okay tomorrow. We don't want to take chances. So we're going to throw the whole thing away. We're not going to wash and pick out and that kind of thing. It's the same thing with eggs. Sometimes you'll come across egg crates that have broken eggs in there. We don't mess around with those. We don't wash them and repack or anything like that. We throw the whole crate away if there's broken eggs in there because of the allergen risk. Okay? Next, we're going to talk about transporting food safely. So this has to do with the vehicles that you use to do pickups and deliveries and that kind of thing. Typically, you have either refrigerated vehicles and you have unrefrigerated vehicles. So the little bit difference between the two, we're going to talk about the safety with both of them. Regardless if they're refrigerated or not, you want to make sure that they're clean at least once a week or as often as necessary. You don't want to transport product in vehicles that are not clean. Make sure they're pest-free, there's no ants in them or anything else. Make sure that you don't use the same vehicle to haul garbage that you use to pick up product. That'd be a no-no. Definitely do not bring pets when you deliver food, so no dogs or cats or comfort animals or anything like that. We don't want to see that in the vehicle. And you want to keep items that can contaminate the food separate from the delivery. So that might be oil or antifreeze or wiper fluid. That shouldn't be anywhere close to the food that you're distributing. And if possible, you can lock and seal your delivery vehicle for food defense reasons. If it is a refrigerated truck, make sure that your reefer temp is set for 41 degrees or lower. and check the readout on the truck's recording device. You can leave that reefer unit on and the vehicle door closed during inactivity to make sure it stays at temp. And you definitely want to pre-cool that refrigerated truck prior to loading, because sometimes the loading might take some time. You want to make sure during the loading process you have that temp already where it needs to be. If you don't have a refrigerated truck and you're still making pickups at stores or transporting product to deliver, you always want to use refrigerated and frozen food. Cover them with thermal blankets, like insulated blankets. Now it's really important to know though that these blankets are not refrigerating your product. It's not okay to just wrap it and think it's going to be okay for hours at a time. What it does, it insulates the temperature to prevent it from rising at a higher rate than if you didn't have if you didn't have the blanket. You still need to stay within that half hour to hour time limit of getting it to point A to point B. Just because you have an insulated thermal blanket doesn't mean that it's going to stay cold forever. It doesn't make a warm product cold or anything like that. So just know how to use it properly. You also could use coolers or ice packs to help insulate those temperatures. It's really important to check the temperature of your refrigerated food when you reach your destination, so you can see how much the temperature has risen in transit from the time you picked it up to the time you get there. And just make sure you keep your drive times in unrefrigerated vehicles to 30 minutes or less. If you have any type of perishable product, your drive time has got to be 30 minutes or less. Otherwise, you're running the risk of that danger zone. Because then you have to think about unloading the vehicle and the time it takes to do that as well. All right, storing food safely. So general storage guidelines, you want to store your refrigerated food at 41 degrees or lower. This includes all cut produce. You want to keep your frozen food frozen solid at 0 degrees or colder. So if that frozen food thaws, you run a risk. So make sure that the frozen food stays frozen solid the whole way through. If you're at a store picking up, for example, and they provide you with meat that's not frozen solid, you should say, "I'm sorry, I cannot take this until it's frozen solid. Please put it back in your freezer. I'll get it next time I come." Don't take that meat thawed or not frozen, because it's not going to last the trip to your agency. You want to monitor these temperatures and record those results in an approved log. So at our food bank, we take temperatures every morning, every afternoon for our cooler, our freezers, even the ambient temperature in the warehouse. It's very important to record that on a daily basis, and then also understand that if there's any type of temperature deviance from what it's supposed to be, it needs to get serviced right away. And you may need to throw food out if it's not holding properly. Okay. Other guidelines, you want to store food only in designated food storage areas. So like a garage or a closet is not a designated food storage area. You'll make sure if food's stored at least 6 inches off the floor or in a pallet, which is 6 inches, stored at least 2 inches away from the walls. Those guidelines are for pest control reasons. So you don't want to ever store food directly on the floor or directly against the wall. That's going to run the risk of bugs or rodents or something you don't want to attract. Obviously, you want to store ready-to-eat food above any type of raw meat, seafood, or poultry. If you're gonna do something along those lines, in the cooler or freezer, not on the same shelf or pallet. Also, want to store food only in food-safe containers, and wrap or cover your food before storing it. So you shouldn't have any open containers of produce or any other type of food. You want to try to wrap it, or we use pallet toppers at our food bank where we make sure that stays covered, especially if it's going to be double stacked. All right, so next we're going to talk about dates. You'll typically see about 4 different types of dates on packaging, and it's based on the stage of process. So you might have a packing or manufacturing date, you might see a sell-by date, you might see a best by or best if used by date, and you might see an expiration or used by date. So let's talk about each of those dates and what they mean to you. The packing and manufacturing date is the first possible stage of that product. It's used by manufacturers for tracking and recall purposes that might have a lot number on there. It is not an expiration date, it's just when that product was packed. The next stage of that product would be the sell-by date. that is a quality date that tells the store how long to display that product for sales, for marketing reasons. So it tells them they need to clear the shelf, put the next product in there. It's still safe to eat past that date. It's for the store's purposes to clear that off the shelf. The next stage of the product's life cycle is the best by or best if used by date. That's a quality date that tells the clients or consumers the date at which the product should be eaten for best flavor or peak quality. It might get stale past that, but it's still safe to consume. It's just for peak flavor, basically. It's best if used by. The last date recommended for the product while peak quality is the expiration date or use by date. This is when the clock starts ticking. This product is still safe. You might be surprised, but your product is still safe to eat past that expiration date. It's not time to throw it away once it reaches the expiration date. Depending on what type of packaging it is, you still have usable shelf life beyond that expiration date. And this is per the USDA Food Keeper guidelines. So, for example, if it is cans or jars or bottles, you still have a full year of usable shelf life on that product beyond the expiration date. That's a great way to reduce waste. If it's a soft-sided, like bagged or boxed, you still have 6 months of safe consumption beyond that expiration date. Obviously, when you talk about perishable product, you have a lot shorter lifespan, so that'd be more like 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what type of product you're talking about. If you want to know more information on expiration dates, I recommend looking at the Food Keeper guidelines. You can look that up. You can even Google it, USDA Food Keeper guidelines. There's a brochure that tells you all about expiration dating and safe consumption beyond that point. So let's look at a food label. What's missing from this label? So all these elements are required for distribution. You're required to have the name and address of the manufacturer, packer, distributor. You're required to have the name of the food, like the common or usual name. In this case, it's oat bran cereal. You're required to have the quantity of the food in the package, whether in this case it's 1 pound or it could be ounces or whatever. You're required to have the ingredients listed. You may be surprised, or you may not realize that the way it's listed on that paragraph for ingredients is according to weight. So the first item listed is the highest percentage of weight in that product, whereas the last item, in this case nutmeg, is the smallest percentage of weight in that product. That's why it's listed last. You're also required to have the list of each major food allergen. That's a requirement because people who have food allergies have to know what's in their food. So what's missing from this? Well, you tell me. Hopefully, if you pay attention, what's missing from this label is the date. In order to be able to use this product, we have to know what the use by date or some type of date on this product is, so we know how much shelf life it has to be safe to consume. Talking about labels, so this is something we don't do at our food bank as far as is repacking food. If you're going to have, for example, a big, bulk, huge 2,000 bag of rice or cereal or something along those lines, you want to scoop it into smaller sized portions and relabel it and so forth. That's called repacking food. That is not something we do because the requirements, the law says that you have to have a clean room. Clean room means that it has to be interior surfaces are durable, easy to clean, like all stainless steel. It has to be built to commercial food service construction standards with drainage and so forth. It has to meet local health regulations. And the TCS food, which means time for perishable food, basically, it should be only repacked in a clean room that can maintain a temperature of 55 degrees or lower. So that clean room, if it cannot maintain 55 degrees or lower, you can't use for repacking any type of perishable product. So we don't have a room like that in our facility, so we don't repack food. Hopefully, if you're an agency, you don't either unless you have a clean room. But the labeling would be another component of that requirement. As far as storing food safely, I want to talk about handling recall food. We get daily recall notices from FDA, USDA, and so forth. And some of them are likely, some of them are very obscure and very unlikely to come through our area. So as Director of Compliance, I don't pass every single one of those along to our team and to agencies and so forth, because I don't want to cry wolf and have everyone tune out on recalls when they may be important if it's likely. So the ones that are likely to come through our area, let's say to the southeast region of the United States, or through a donor we normally work with, or food that we regularly come across, I will make sure to to pass along that notice to our volunteer team, to our receiving team, to distribution team, as well as all of our agencies, to be on the lookout. If they come across any of this product, need to set it aside before disposing of it, and letting us know, where they got it from, how much they got, and so forth. So we have to get all this information back to the donor so they can safely recall all the product that they get. But definitely notify us before destroying it and disposing of it. But definitely don't distribute it either. So that's just a little thing on recalls. But the more traceable we can be, the better for accountability and for safety. Also, for storing food safety, you want to think about FIFO rotation. If you ever heard of FIFO or FIFO, FIFO stands for first in, first out rotation of inventory, or FIFO is first expired, first out. That has to do with reducing your waste and being efficient with your space you're working with. So what you want to do is basically check your delivery expiration date and store food with the earliest date in front of food with later dates, and use that oldest food first. So what you don't want to do is put the new stuff in front of the old stuff, and then the old stuff gets older and older and hidden behind somewhere you never get to it. That's wasteful. The only exception to this rule is for fresh, ready-to-eat products, and that should be given out based on expiration dates and so forth. But yeah, basically FIFO, FIFO, you need to be doing some type of rotation of inventory to make sure that stays followed. All right, so the last concept I'm going to go over today is cleaning and sanitizing. So you're going to learn about how and when to clean and sanitize, how to manually clean and sanitize your tools and utensils, how to handle garbage, and how to spot pests. So first concept is cleaning versus sanitizing. What's the difference between the two? Sometimes people may use those terms interchangeably. The difference is that cleaning removes food and dirt from a surface, while sanitizing reduces the pathogens on that surface to safe levels. So just like when you're washing your hands and you're using sanitizer, the cleaning or washing of your hands removes the food and dirt from your hands or from the surface if you're going to wipe walls up like that, while the sanitizer, if you're going to spray sanitizing solution or dip silverware or dishes in sanitizing solution, what that does after its surface has been cleaned is reduces those pathogens to safe levels, if that makes sense. So the question would be, what needs to be cleaned and what needs to be cleaned and sanitized? Well, you only need to clean if it's not going to touch food. So stuff like walls and floors and storage shelves and garbage containers, you can clean that without using a sanitizing solution. Where you need to use sanitizer in addition to that is if the surface is going to touch food. And that could be like plastic food bins, or ladles, or scales, or prep tables, or sorting tables, or scoops, or anything that's going to touch food. You need to make sure it's not only gets cleaned but sanitized as well. Okay? So how we do that? The best way they describe is through these 5 steps, where it's scrape and remove the food from the surface, you wash the surface, rinse the surface, sanitize the surface, then allow that surface to air dry. Best way to visualize this is if you ever worked in a restaurant before and you have a 3-compartment sink. The first compartment of that sink is used for scraping the food and washing the food with soap. So that, if you imagine the 3-compartment, the first compartment is scraping it and soaping it, right? The second compartment of that 3-compartment sink is used just for hot water, where you're rinsing off the soap. And that third compartment of that sink is used for the hot sanitizing solution, where you're dipping it in there for 30 seconds, and then you're putting it on the rack to air dry. That's the proper way to clean and sanitize. As far as when to do this, you want to do that before and after use of any piece of equipment that comes into contact with the food. Definitely before repackaging any food. If you're going to change to a new product or between allergens, as well as after 4 hours if the item's been in constant use. A lot of this stuff has more to do with cooking, but if you have a soup kitchen or, for example, some type of cooking, make sure you follow those steps. As far as handling garbage correctly, definitely want to remove garbage as quickly as possible. You do not want to leave it in your facility overnight or over the weekend. Always want to clean the inside and outside your garbage cans often. I would suggest weekly or maybe every 2 weeks. Always leave the lids closed on your outdoor dumpsters because that attracts pests, as well as keeping your indoor containers covered when they're not in use. It's really important not to use the type of garbage cans that don't have lids because you're going to have a pest issue real quick. And that is the food safety training for the handler level. I want to thank you for your attention today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My phone number is 904-201-4413, or you can email me at edarkatch@feedingnefl.org. Stay safe out there.